This morning we saw a great example of a completely digital brand that has successfully grown, continues to grow, is profitable, all the things we hoped might be possible a few years back. We looked also in our various sessions at connectedness between individuals, between machines and machine learning, and between marketers and the people they're hoping to reach. And it's been a great story of progress and of real value adding by publishers and content creators. For many of us, though, particularly the older ones amongst us, almost the last part of the publishing mix to step into the digital age was the whole area of subscriptions, subscription renewals, which is ironic because that's the driver of the revenue that's most closely linked to the content we create. So our first session in our main auditorium today brings a story of how it is possible to bring that activity right up to date and how important it is to make every subscriber feel valued. So to talk about bringing the audience inside, please welcome the director of Times Insider at the New York Times from the United States, Francesca.
Hi there. Good. I can hear myself. Thank you so much for coming to this. I know that it's hard to tear yourself away from lunch, the most important part of the day. I want to just pause a second right on this first slide, because when I wrote that down and I started thinking about it, I just got a bunch of question marks in my head and thought, huh? What does this even mean, and why are we doing this? A mini history lesson, which you probably all know. Of course, many years ago, newspapers just kind of used to be a fire hose of content, and it was a really one-way street. Readers would read what editors and journalists wrote and just kind of accept that at face value. And then maybe they could write a letter to the editor, and maybe that would get picked up and published, but probably not. And then community in the digital age started coming in around the edges, and we entered this new space where there could be a little bit more of an exchange. And that, of course, has grown and grown. And now we have something really exciting where we actually have a little bit more of a two-way street. And at the Times, for one, we really want people to come into the Times, learn a little bit more about who we are, and we want to learn a little bit more about who our readers are and what they're thinking, and have a real sense of engagement there. So just two things before I get going with this. First, I want you to know that this is a strategic problem, but we solved it with a lot of editorial solutions. So a lot of what you're going to see is kind of editorial. And the second thing is the solutions are very, very specific to the New York Times, but I think there are ideas here that can be used at all sorts of media companies. So here we go. What is the New York Times? Hands up if you've ever heard of the New York Times. Great, right? It's a newspaper. It is in this kind of imposing, faceless building. It has journalists, but how many reporters could you name? Do you know how we create stories at the Times? Do you know how many correspondents we have? It's not a quiz, but as you think about it, you probably just think, well, I know the brand name, and sometimes I read the stories, but I don't know who writes them or where they're written from. And I like to think of it as kind of a Charlie and the Chocolate Factory thing. I don't know if you've ever read this book when you were little, but in England, everybody reads it. And there's this wonderful line in the book, and they say, nobody ever comes in and nobody ever goes out. And that's exactly what we don't want to do at the Times. We don't want it to be this faceless place where nobody ever goes in and nobody knows what's happening there. That's not good. So what we're trying to do is get to know one another. If you're a Times reader, or if you're possibly about to part with some of your money to become a subscriber, we want you to know some things like, who's writing these stories? Are Times reporters based on location? How does reporting work anyway? How many journalists does it take to put together a newspaper? The answer is a lot, a lot, a lot. And how does the newspaper even get from the newsroom to my doorstep? How does it work? See? Aren't we fun once you go inside? That's actually a look at the Times newsroom, and just for fun to entertain you. It's on Pulitzer Day, so it's a particularly exciting time. We're not normally that crowded, but that's who we are. Those are the faces and the people we want you to get to know. So how are we going to do it? We are going to open the fourth wall and bring in readers as participants. We want to give readers the idea that we're all in this crazy journalism thing together. We want to show how the sausage is made, to use kind of maybe a German-sounding expression, which is really like, show the details, explain what's happening, and we want to do it within reason. We don't want to embarrass ourselves. We don't want to tell you too much, because then it becomes kind of icky. And we also want to get to know the readers. Our goal is to get people up close and personal with the Times. So this is the framework of how it works for us. We essentially want to answer 4 questions with everything that we do. We want to explain to you how we work. We want to explain to you who we are. We want to explain to you what we know. The depth of knowledge is really profound. And we want to share with you a little bit about what we like or our recommendations. And we think that answering these 4 questions in all sorts of different ways is going to make a deeper connection with the Times. So here are some of the specific things that we have done. And as I mentioned before, these are editorial solutions to sort of a strategic business problem. So hopefully they're interesting to you and you can take some takeaways here. The first thing we do is we write stories. We're the Times. That's what we often do. But we write stories about the stories that we write. So like a conversation with a friend, these can be really human, they can be direct, they can be funny, they can be sort of self-deprecating. We can really get the reporters or photographers or editors writing in a really unvarnished way. We also do podcasts, and I think that's not unlike a story, but it's direct to your ear, and that can feel really intimate. We write a newsletter, which can feel like you're part of a club. It can feel very sort of friendly and really get at the membership aspect of this. We do events, which of course are incredibly high touch if you can actually go to one. And if you can't go to one, we do digital chats and live streaming, which is access to events and access to reporters without actually being there. So I'm going to just take a few moments to actually show you some of the stories that we've worked on, just so you can kind of get a sense. The idea here is really to go to sort of tell you the story behind the story. We want to bring you behind the scenes. How do we do that? We want to show you where reporters have gone or what it's taken to land an extraordinary scoop, and explain the background of really major stories. In many ways, I find that that can actually sharpen the story as a whole and bring a lot into perspective. And we want to put a face on it. So I've actually put a few of our stories in here, so bear with me. I don't know if you can read the orange, but I'll read you a teeny little bit of it if you can't see it. This was written by our correspondent, Craig Smith. He just filed it on Friday, and he did this wonderful piece about ice fishing and going under a layer of ice, which is kind of extraordinary. And that's him in the photo, which I think is really important to show, because we show that he's on location. He's actually doing this, which sounds kind of obvious and duh-like, but actually people don't necessarily make that connection. So he writes, beneath the ice it was perceptibly warmer. Getting in and out, swaddled in layers of clothing, tested my aging frame. Both Aaron and I ended up with water in our boots, obviously a problem in sub-zero weather. And he goes on to talk about the ice and what it was like. And he says the air was heavy and salty in this cavern underneath the ice. Sounds were muffled except for the unnerving gurgle of running water, because that little space that he's in is about to be filled with water. It's kind of terrifying when you think about it. This is a wonderful little snippet from Ben Solomon, who's one of our really fantastic video journalists at the Times. And here he's writing about what it was like to cover Ebola. You know, I know this is sort of an old story now, but when you read about Ebola, you think about everyone who's going through it and how awful it is, and you read all the details, but you possibly forget that, oh my God, there's a guy who has to suit up and go into these extremely dangerous environments. So here he writes, as reporters, we needed to remain resilient ourselves. The virus was all around, but remained unseen. That's terrifying. That should kind of make you sit up in your chair and think, wow, I wouldn't like to be him. He writes that every night he would nervously go to sleep hoping he had done everything right. Had he used enough chlorine? Had he been rinsed off? Was he going to get this awful virus? And here's another one from a reporter who traveled 9.5 hours in water to cover a story in the Amazon. Again, when you read the story, there's no mention of that. You just think, oh, well, of course, it's just a story in the Times. But, you know, she put herself in real harm's way to actually get this story. And I love this line at the end. As with every other time I have ended up in a dangerous situation while reporting, my mind went over and over where I had made the stupid mistake that had landed me in such a spot. Oops. And finally, this looks like kind of a boring photo, but is actually the origination of one of our most extraordinary stories last year. And I'll just read this for you. The envelope looked legitimate. I opened it anxiously and was astonished. Inside were what appeared to be pages from Mr. Trump's 1995 tax records. So there it is. That was the boring gray mailbox. It didn't look like anything special, but I think understanding the reporter's perspective on this and this sort of, oh my goodness, drop everything moment was really extraordinary. And it tells you a lot about what the Times is doing behind the scenes. So quickly, moving on to podcasts. Again, I think they're sort of a version of a story, but you know, we do similar things. So the little piece that's photographed here is a reporter's notebook, and the reporter is talking about going to Mar-a-Lago, which is our President Trump's Florida home, and how extraordinary that was, and sharing some of the things that they had seen. But also podcasts, I mean, they have a host, so they're very personality-driven. They can feel extremely intimate, and you know, actually hearing someone's voice in your ear is quite a lot more intimate than seeing something on a screen or reading it in print. You also have this sort of wonderful conversational, relaxed tone. Someone in my group is the host, and then we have different reporters come in and share, like, what did you see? What was it like? What did you do? And I think that sort of listeners can feel a little bit like a fly on the wall, or they can feel like they're sort of sitting in on a dinner party conversation. It's essentially, if you were sitting next to a Times reporter at a dinner, what would you ask them? Hopefully we're getting at all of those very questions. The newsletter is really important. It's a really, really important tool for us, and we love our newsletter. It gets opened at a rate of around 60%, so I think people really respond to, again, this sort of personality-driven thing, very intimate, conversational, and relaxed, and feeling like inside like a member. So here's an example. I don't know if you can see any of that, but we have this sort of insidery greeting, and I write this newsletter, but you know, we start the same every time. Hello, insiders. So you sort of are reminded that you're part of this set, and rather than just kind of dumping in a link farm, which is totally depressing and nobody wants to see, maybe some people want to see, forgive me. I don't necessarily want to just see a link farm. You know, we'll try and write through a few of the interesting things. We always have an original photo from the Times so that you can sort of see what's going on. And in this particular newsletter, which went out on Saturday, we did like a little fun giveaway to get people engaged, and we have these truth buttons. We said, okay, 50 readers, you're going to get a truth button. Just write to us and tell us what your favorite section of the Times is. We didn't do that with any purpose other than people get quite excited to tell us what their favorite section of the Times is, and it's interesting. And then I do the same kind of sign off every time, so that there's sort of a familiarity with it, and they know who I am. Events are hugely important. They're really, really high touch. They build intimacy. There's sort of a surprise and delight quality to them, and they can really connect like-minded people around things that they care about, which in this case is the Times. The readers sort of go from a solitary behavior, which might be listening or reading or opening a newsletter at home, to attending this kind of communal thing. And so the connection becomes very, very real. And just to illustrate it, just two pictures from some of the events that we've run in the past. It's Nick Kristof over there, an incredibly dynamic speaker, and then our Modern Love podcasting crew talking about podcasts. And then finally, the digital chats live streaming thing. This is really solving the scalability problem of events. I don't know if any of you work in that space at all, but scalability is always the problem. How do we get, we have more than 100 readers, we have more than 200 readers. How do we get them engaged if they can't go to a space in New York and listen to our journalists firsthand? So we can do a lot with live streaming, answering reader questions, soliciting questions in advance, building in quizzes and challenges. We did a wonderful event with our crosswords editor, who's, if you're a puzzle kind of person, sort of a celebrity in that arena, and he did this sort of live streamed puzzle quiz that people were writing in the answers and getting really enthusiastic about. People feel that if a journalist responds to them, even in a digital space, it's incredibly fulfilling. So why are we even doing any of this? Why are you even sitting here? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and there are a lot of reasons right now. One, of course, is fake news. I'm so sorry to even have to bring up fake news, but readers need reassurance right now. We need to remind people that these are real stories. We're actually going out and getting them. Our reporters are upstanding people. They're also humans who are funny and sometimes make mistakes and fix them. We need to be really transparent. It's really important. If the media has been set up as quote unquote the enemy, and I'm really speaking about the US right now, then how do we counteract that? This is one way. Trust is it's the same thing, really. The news business is built on trust, so how can we cultivate more trust with people? By showing who we are and what we do. Also, we want to communicate to people that doing journalism is hard and complicated, and it's expensive. It's not something, you don't get a story overnight. You don't swing into the Amazon for 5 minutes. You don't cover Mosul on a whim. You have to know people. You need translators. You need fixers. You need to drive places. You might need to walk through, Amazonian water for 9.5 hours, which sounds awful. We need to communicate that to people. It's really important. And also, we're doing journalism in a social media age. When everything is open and transparent, we also need to play that game. Everybody else is putting it out there, we should too. And I'll just go back to my sausage comment from earlier. We want to put it out there within reason, right? We don't want to embarrass ourselves. Nobody wants to do that. And also there's competition in the marketplace. So how does the New York Times differentiate themselves from any other media publication? By showing this is what we do and this is who we are. So my final slide is, should you bring the audience inside? Can you do it with a different kind of media company? I think so. I know these answers are very specific for what the Times does, but every media company has a story to tell. You can be personable, you can be human, you should be vulnerable to an extent, be candid and be funny. I think that there's a really, really interesting opportunity to connect with your audience out there, and they'll respond in kind. And that's it. And I made it in with 16 seconds to go. So if anyone has a quick question, go for it.
So thank you very much. We can take one quick question before we turn to you, the audience, to answer a question, but it isn't compulsory. And I'm sure, Francesca, you'll be around for a while if there are any questions off stage. Yeah?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Thank you.